Sparks in the Iron Age. In the ashes of the Civil War, America was reborn, not through politics, but through furnaces. The smoke never left the sky. In the years after 1865, as the last musket fire of the Civil War faded into memory, another sound began to rise over America: the hiss of steam, the clang of hammers, and the thunder of trains cutting across a raw, rebuilding nation. Cities that had once been scarred by war were now lit by the orange glow of furnaces. It was the birth cry of a new America, not the one written in the Declaration of Independence, but one forged in steel and smoke. The Civil War had left the United States in ruins. The South lay in ashes, its plantations shattered. The North, though victorious, was exhausted and divided. Yet out of this wreckage came an idea that would redefine the nation. Industrial power could be the new freedom. A nation of iron and fire. In the 1860s, steel was still a luxury. Bridges were built of brittle iron. Rails cracked under the weight of locomotives. The future demanded something stronger. In the smoky heart of Pittsburgh, a city once dismissed as a backwater, a quiet revolution began. It was there that a Scottish immigrant named Andrew Carnegie walked through the mills for the first time. He was barely 30, restless and fiercely ambitious. To Carnegie, the furnaces were not just machines, they were instruments of destiny. America, he believed, could rise again, not by rebuilding its farms, but by forging its cities from fire. In 1872, Carnegie visited Henry Bessemer in England, whose new process for refining molten iron promised to make steel faster and cheaper than ever before. The young industrialist saw what others missed. The Bessemer converter wasn't just a machine, it was a revolution in metal. Within a decade, Carnegie steel would become the backbone of the American age of expansion, the roar of progress. By the 1880s, Pittsburgh had become the empire of smoke. Day and night, flames poured from the mills, painting the rivers orange. Ships carried steel rails westward, where men were laying track across mountains and deserts. Every spike driven into the earth was a heartbeat in America's rebirth. Steel built the railroads, connected the Atlantic to the Pacific, and stitched together a wounded nation. Steel raised bridges across rivers, skyscrapers into the clouds, and armored ships upon the seas. It was not Congress or the Constitution that united America. It was the rails and girders that turned isolation into empire. But progress, like fire, demanded fuel, and the fuel was human. The cost of the furnace. Inside those Pittsburgh mills, the heat was unbearable. Men worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. The roar of the furnaces was deafening. The air burned with iron dust. Immigrant laborers from Ireland, Poland, and Italy toiled for pennies, their faces blackened with soot, their lungs filled with ash. Yet, for many, it was better than hunger. America's promise was not comfort, it was opportunity through endurance. The immigrants who stepped off ships in New York and Boston didn't find streets paved with gold. They found streets paved with steel, and they were expected to lay them. Still, the workers sang as they labored. The clang of metal became their rhythm, the furnace their cathedral. They believed somehow that the fire would purify not only the metal, but their lives. The Titans rise. As the smoke thickened over Pennsylvania, a new class of men emerged, the industrial Titans. There was John D. Rockefeller, refining oil in Cleveland, turning black crude into the lifeblood of the machines. There was J.P. Morgan, the financier, who saw industry not as a craft, but as a kingdom of numbers. And at the center stood Carnegie, the self-made steel king, whose name became synonymous with progress and power. Carnegie's empire stretched from the Monongahela Valley to the skyscrapers of New York. He promised that his mills would build a nation out of iron, and in many ways they did. His steel built the Brooklyn Bridge, the Chicago skyline, and the rails that carried settlers westward. But behind every triumph was tension. The men who worked his furnaces began to whisper about wages, about safety, about dignity. Progress had a price, and they were paying it. The shadow of smoke. The summer of 1892 brought the reckoning. At the Homestead Steelworks, workers went on strike, demanding fair pay and safer conditions. Carnegie, then in Scotland, left the crisis to his ruthless manager, Henry Clay Frick. Frick, determined to break the Union, hired Pinkerton agents, armed mercenaries to reclaim the plant. When the Pinkertons arrived by river, the workers met them with rifles and fists. Shots echoed across the Monongahela. The battle lasted for hours. Men were killed, dozens wounded, and the mill yard ran red. America, for a moment, saw what lay beneath its progress, a war between those who owned the furnaces and those who fed them. The Homestead strike became a symbol, a burning scar on the conscience of industrial America. Yet, the furnaces kept roaring. Smoke still rose over Pittsburgh, darker than ever. The empire expands. By the turn of the century, steel had conquered everything. The skyscrapers of New York rose higher each year. The Flatiron Building, the Singer Tower, the Woolworth Building, all standing as monuments to American ambition. The same steel that had armed the Union now girded an industrial empire. But the men who worked the furnaces never saw a cent of it. For them, progress remained a distant promise, glimpsed only in the glow of molten metal. The grit behind the glory. Behind every shining city, every bridge, every locomotive, was a man no one remembered. A Polish immigrant who died in a blast furnace explosion, an Irish foreman crushed by a girder, a nameless child who hauled coal to keep the fires alive. Their names were lost, but their work endured. As the 20th century dawned, America had become the workshop of the world. Steel poured from the mills by the millions of tons. It built not only cities, but identities. The idea that strength, innovation, and endurance were the true American virtues. Yet the question lingered: could a nation built on smoke ever breathe clean air? From smoke to skyline. In the decades that followed, the industry shaped everything. World War I demanded steel for tanks, ships, and weapons. The Great Depression tested the limits of both the rich and the poor. And when America rose again in World War II, its victory was fueled by the same furnaces that had once built railroads and bridges. The blast furnaces of Pittsburgh, Gary, and Bethlehem glowed through the night, turning iron ore into the instruments of freedom. The arsenal of democracy, President Roosevelt called it. America steel, once a symbol of greed, now became the sword of liberty. But after the war, as peace returned, the smoke began to thin. Automation replaced men. Global competition rose. The same mills that had built a nation began to fall silent. The men who forged the nation. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and Vanderbilt, names that would define an age. Their ambition built railroads, refineries, and fortunes, but also empires that bent entire cities to their will. The city lights flickered like stars reflected in steel. By the end of the 19th century, America was no longer a frontier, it was a forge. The clang of hammers had replaced the crack of muskets, and the new generals of this industrial battlefield were not soldiers, but men of vision and iron will. They were Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, the architects of an empire built not by bloodlines or crowns, but by coal, oil, steel, and steam. This is their story, how four men, born from obscurity, would reshape America's destiny, redefine power itself, and leave behind a legacy that still echoes in the very bones of modern civilization. The Age of Titans. The Civil War had barely ended when a new struggle began, not over slavery or union, but over control of America's future. The country was exploding with opportunity. Railroads carved paths across the wilderness. Oil gushed from the Pennsylvania hills. Iron turned to steel, and steamships roared across the Atlantic. But opportunity alone wasn't enough. It needed men ruthless enough to seize it, brilliant enough to expand it, and unyielding enough to defend it. These men would be called captains of industry by admirers, and robber barons by enemies. Whatever the label, they were united by one thing: they refused to accept limits. The Commodore, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Before Carnegie poured his first ingot, before Rockefeller drilled his first well, there was Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who rose from poverty to become the bridge between the age of sail and the age of steam. Born in 1794 on Staten Island to a poor farmer, Vanderbilt quit school at 11 and began ferrying passengers across New York Harbor in a small boat. By his 30s, he was running a steamship empire. He was blunt, hard, and cunning, a man who played business like a knife fight. When railroads became the arteries of a growing nation, Vanderbilt saw the future and pounced. He invested millions in the New York Central Railroad, linking New York to Chicago and beyond. He didn't just build railroads, he built the nation's circulatory system. At his peak, Vanderbilt's wealth equaled more than $200 billion in today's money. But more than fortune, he left behind the blueprint of the American tycoon: dominate, consolidate, and never, ever play fair. When asked about his ruthless tactics, Vanderbilt replied simply, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" It was the beginning of a new creed in America. Power was the law. The Oil King, John D. Rockefeller. If Vanderbilt mastered movement, Rockefeller mastered monopoly. Born in 1839 to a traveling con man and a devout mother, Rockefeller grew up with thrift in his veins. He began as a bookkeeper in Cleveland, recording every penny with almost religious precision. But when he saw the world's first oil boom in Pennsylvania, he recognized something greater than fuel. It was the future. In 1870, he founded Standard Oil, and within a decade, it controlled over 90% of America's oil refining. He slashed prices to crush competitors, bought out rivals quietly, and forced railroads to give him secret rebates. To the public, it looked like efficiency. In truth, it was domination disguised as progress. He once said, "Competition is a sin." And for Rockefeller, it truly was. He didn't want to compete. He wanted to control. By the 1880s, his empire stretched across pipelines, rail cars, and refineries. Oil powered factories, lit homes, and ran the engines of war and commerce alike. And every drop passed through the invisible hand of Rockefeller. When journalists exposed his monopolistic practices, the nation was outraged. But even as the U.S. government broke Standard Oil apart in 1911, Rockefeller's wealth only multiplied. He had invented not just the oil industry, but the modern corporate structure itself. In the end, he gave away over $500 million to science, medicine, and education. The man who once squeezed every penny out of America would also fund its future, creating universities, hospitals, and research institutions that still bear his legacy. IV, the Steel King, Andrew Carnegie. If Rockefeller refined oil, Carnegie refined ambition. He was born in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland, the son of a poor weaver. His family immigrated to America with nothing but hope. Carnegie started as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, earning $1.20 a week. But he had something no machine could forge: vision. He rose fast, first as a telegraph operator, then as a railroad manager under Thomas A. Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad. When the Civil War broke out, Carnegie supplied iron bridges and rails to the Union Army. By war's end, he was a millionaire. But it was steel that would make him immortal. He saw that steel, light, flexible, and strong, was the skeleton of the modern world. In the 1970s, he adopted the Bessemer process, a revolutionary method that could produce tons of steel in minutes. His Carnegie Steel Company soon became the largest and most profitable industrial enterprise in history. He built the Brooklyn Bridge, the Empire State's foundations, and the rails that spanned a continent. To the public, Carnegie preached the gospel of wealth, that the rich had a moral duty to give back. He donated libraries, universities, and concert halls across America. But behind his philanthropy was a darker truth. In 1892, at his Homestead steel plant, a brutal labor strike turned into open warfare. Workers demanding fair wages were met with Pinkerton guards, and the confrontation left 10 men dead. While Carnegie was in Scotland, his name was forever stained by the blood spilled in Homestead. He retired a millionaire, but the guilt followed him to his death. "The man who dies rich dies disgraced," he once wrote, words that haunted him for the rest of his life. IV, the Banker King, J.P. Morgan. When others built industries, J.P. Morgan built the system that ruled them. Born into wealth in 1837, Morgan was not a creator, but a consolidator. He didn't mine, refine, or manufacture. He organized. He saw chaos in the markets and turned it into order, profit, and power. Morgan's empire began in banking, but it soon stretched into railroads, electricity, and steel. When Carnegie decided to retire, it was Morgan who bought him out for $480 million, a deal so vast it created U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in world history. He was the quiet king behind the throne. When the U.S. Treasury ran out of gold in 1895, it was Morgan, not the government, who saved the dollar by lending it $60 million in gold. When Wall Street panicked in 1907, it was Morgan who locked bankers in his library and forced them to bail out failing institutions, single-handedly stopping a national collapse. He was a man of contradictions, a devout Episcopalian with a black nose from chronic rosacea, a patron of art who ruled by fear. He believed that wealth should serve order, not chaos, and yet in that order, democracy itself seemed to bend. President Theodore Roosevelt called him one of the malefactors of great wealth. But when Morgan died in 1913, the same Roosevelt admitted he was the last American who truly ruled Wall Street. Blood, sweat, and steel. Behind every gleaming skyscraper were the calloused hands of laborers, immigrants who toiled in choking smoke, melted iron, and endless nights. Progress came at a human cost the Titans rarely counted. The steel did not shine when it was born. It screamed. In the infernos of Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Gary, men labored in heat that melted iron and scorched flesh. Sparks flew like fireflies in a mechanical night, and the air itself seemed to burn. To the men who worked there, progress wasn't a dream, it was a furnace, and they were the fuel. This is their story, not of tycoons and bankers, but of those who built America with their bare hands, the forgotten millions whose sweat, blood, and courage forged a nation of steel. The immigrants who built the dream. At the turn of the 20th century, ships arrived daily at Ellis Island, carrying waves of immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Poland, and Eastern Europe. They came with nothing but calloused palms and hope. Hope that America, the land of opportunity, would give them a chance to rise. Instead, they were met by the roar of machines and the choking breath of industry. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, Homestead, Bethlehem, and Gary swallowed them whole. 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. The pay was barely enough to survive, but for men who had escaped famine or tyranny, it was better than hunger. A Polish worker named Jan Kowalski once wrote to his family, "The sun here is not the same. It is red like fire and never sets. It lives in the mill." For millions like Jan, America's promise came with a price: their health, their dignity, sometimes their lives. 2. The Furnace Kings. By 1900, Andrew Carnegie's steel empire was the largest industrial operation on Earth. The city of Pittsburgh glowed orange day and night. Hell with the lid off, one writer called it. Inside the mills, temperatures reached over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Molten metal hissed as it poured into molds. Men moved like shadows in the glare, their faces coated with soot, their eyes red from the heat. There were no safety laws. If a man slipped into the molten pit, his body vaporized instantly. His name was crossed off the payroll, and another immigrant was hired the next day. The average life expectancy of a steelworker was under 40. Children carried water and fuel. Women washed the rags their husbands came home in, black with iron dust and blood. And yet, the steel never stopped flowing. Every bridge, every rail, every skyscraper, from the Brooklyn Bridge to the Empire State Building, was built on their sacrifice. They were ghosts with paychecks, invisible in the photographs of progress. 3. The Men of Smoke. If you stood on the Monongahela River in 1890, You could see entire neighborhoods living in the shadow of the mills. Small wooden houses crammed together, laundry lines sagging with soot-covered clothes. The air reeked of sulfur and burnt coal. At dawn, the whistle blew, and a sea of men flooded toward the factories. They spoke in a dozen languages: Polish, Slovak, Italian, German, Irish, but they shared one rhythm: the pounding of steel. They carried with them scars and stories. Some had been farmers, others miners or blacksmiths. In America, they became feeders, pourers, and catchers, each job more dangerous than the last. A single mistake could end a life. One worker might be blinded by slag, another crushed by falling beams. The company paid no compensation. A widow might receive a few dollars, if that. In the taverns after dark, the men drank to forget. The same hands that built the nation also trembled from exhaustion. 4. The price of progress. The great industrialists, Carnegie, Frick, Rockefeller, Morgan, spoke of progress and prosperity. They built libraries, universities, and cathedrals of commerce. But in the mills, progress looked like pain. Steel was America's backbone, but its bones were brittle. Accidents were daily news. In 1905 alone, over 500 steelworkers died in Pittsburgh's mills. Burns, explosions, collapsed scaffolds. It didn't matter. Production came first. Workers began to whisper about unions. They wanted 8-hour days, fair pay, safety measures, nothing more. But to the mill owners, unionizing was rebellion, and rebellion had to be crushed. 5. The Homestead Inferno. In the summer of 1892, the conflict that had simmered for years finally erupted. At Carnegie's Homestead Steelworks near Pittsburgh, the workers' union stood up against wage cuts. Carnegie himself was overseas in Scotland, leaving his ruthless lieutenant Henry Clay Frick in charge. Frick was determined to break the union. He built fences topped with barbed wire around the mill. Locals called it Fort Frick. He fired every worker who refused to accept the new wage and hired Pinkerton detectives, armed mercenaries, to protect strikebreakers. On the night of July 6, 1892, a river barge full of Pinkertons drifted toward the mill. Thousands of workers waited on the shore, armed with clubs and rifles. The standoff lasted only minutes before gunfire erupted. The Battle of Homestead raged for 12 bloody hours. 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons were killed. Dozens were wounded. The river ran red, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with iron dust. The strike failed. The Union was destroyed. But that day, the world saw the truth. America's industrial miracle was built on a battlefield. 6. The women of the mills. While men fought and died in the furnaces, women fought a quieter war at home. They raised children in shanty towns built beside the mills, washed the soot off their husbands' clothes, and prayed the whistle wouldn't blow early, a sign that another man had fallen. Some worked in textile factories, others in sweatshops, sewing uniforms or gloves for mill workers. Their pay was even lower, their shifts just as long. Many became widows before the age of 30. They buried their dead and went back to work. Their names never made the headlines, but without them, the furnaces would have gone cold. 7. The children of smoke. Child labor was the open secret of the industrial age. In the steel towns, boys as young as 10 years old carried tools, cleaned machines, or shoveled coal. Photographer Louis Hine, working for the National Child Labor Committee, captured their faces. Tiny bodies covered in soot, bare feet on the factory floor, eyes far older than their years. One boy, standing by a glowing furnace in 1910, told Hine, "I don't know my birthday, sir. I only know the night shift." For every gleaming bridge that rose, there were children who never saw daylight. Progress was measured not in years, but in childhoods lost to labor. Empires of greed and genius. The Gilded Age glittered, but beneath the gold lay iron chains. In the late 19th century, America sparkled like a diamond in the sun. Railroads stretched from ocean to ocean. Cities rose from dust, and fortunes were made faster than the human mind could imagine. But every diamond has its flaws, and behind the shimmering facade of the Gilded Age lay a ruthless empire built on power, deception, and ambition. This was not merely an age of innovation, it was an age of titans, where greed and genius walked hand in hand, reshaping the very soul of America. The Gilded Age began not in the palaces of power, but in the furnaces of industry. The Civil War had left the nation scarred yet hungry, hungry for progress, for profit, for purpose. As cities like New York, Pittsburgh, and Chicago grew from muddy settlements into gleaming metropolises, a new class of rulers emerged, not kings crowned by birthright, but by capital. Men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Cornelius Vanderbilt stood above all others. Their portraits hung in mansions, their names whispered in awe and fear. They weren't just businessmen, they were empire builders. Each one saw America not as it was, but as it could be, and each was willing to bend morality, law, and humanity itself to shape that vision. The gospel of wealth and the gospel of power. Andrew Carnegie had risen from a poor Scottish immigrant to the king of steel. He believed in what he called the gospel of wealth, that the rich were chosen by destiny to uplift society. But his version of charity was written in molten iron. In his steel mills, the clang of metal never ceased. The men who worked there sweated and bled 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Molten steel burned through flesh like paper, and accidents were common. Yet Carnegie's empire thrived. His steel built America's bridges, railroads, and skyscrapers. He had forged the backbone of a nation, and in doing so, had forged an empire of both prosperity and pain. But Carnegie's moral idealism had a dark mirror in John D. Rockefeller, the oil baron who transformed crude oil into pure gold. With his company, Standard Oil, Rockefeller refined not only petroleum, but the art of monopoly. He undercut rivals, bought out competitors, and controlled every link in the chain, from the wells to the refineries to the railroads that carried his oil. To his supporters, Rockefeller was a genius of efficiency. To his enemies, he was the embodiment of greed, a man whose empire strangled competition and crushed small businesses beneath its boot. His secret deals with railroad tycoons gave him discounts no one else could dream of. Soon, nearly 90% of the nation's oil industry was under his command. Rockefeller once said, "Competition is a sin," and in the empire of greed, that became gospel truth. Smoke-filled rooms and silent deals. While Carnegie and Rockefeller waged industrial wars, J.P. Morgan fought battles of finance. His empire was not built in mills or oil fields, but in smoke-filled rooms lined with mahogany and thick with cigar smoke. Morgan was not a creator, but a consolidator. He bought struggling companies, merged rivals, and turned chaos into order at a price. Morgan controlled capital like a general controls armies. When the U.S. Treasury nearly went bankrupt in 1895, it was Morgan, not the president, who stepped in to rescue the nation, lending millions in gold to stabilize the economy. That act made him both a savior and a shadow monarch. Americans realized something unsettling. The government did not control the economy. Men like J.P. Morgan did. His influence reached every corner of industry. When he combined Edison's electric company with others to form General Electric, or merged rival steel firms to create U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history, he wasn't just making deals, he was rearranging the structure of power in America. Every merger made him richer. Every deal tightened his grip. The invisible web of finance he spun connected Wall Street, Washington, and the White House itself. The railroad kings and the golden chains. Before oil and steel ruled the world, Cornelius Vanderbilt ruled the rails. Known as the Commodore, he built a transportation network that linked a continent. His fortune came not from invention, but from domination. He crushed competitors with rate wars, bribed politicians, and manipulated stock markets. He once said, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" And that single sentence captured the heart of the Gilded Age. The railroads were more than iron tracks. They were veins of commerce, pulsing with the lifeblood of the economy. But they also symbolized something darker: the unholy alliance between wealth and politics. Legislatures were bought, judges influenced, newspapers silenced. For every mile of track that stretched westward, corruption grew deeper. When farmers protested unfair freight rates, they were crushed by the combined might of railroad trusts and politicians. America was expanding, but its democracy was shrinking. Behind the gold, the iron chains. To the public eye, this was a golden age. Mansions glittered along Fifth Avenue. Banquets overflowed with champagne. Electric lights illuminated cities like never before. But beneath that brilliance lay suffering. While tycoons built marble palaces, workers lived in tenement slums, breathing soot and sewage. Child labor was rampant. Factory accidents fatal. The divide between the rich and poor grew wider with every passing year. Mark Twain, who coined the term the Gilded Age, understood the truth. The gold was only a thin layer covering the rot beneath. Newspapers of the era began exposing scandals: the Credit Mobilier affair, the Whiskey Ring, the Standard Oil Trust. Yet the system endured. Why? Because the empire of greed was also an empire of genius. These men weren't mere thieves. They were builders, visionaries who saw the future before anyone else. They created jobs, connected cities, and laid the foundation for modern America. Without them, the skyscrapers, automobiles, and electric grids we know today might never have existed. But every innovation carried a cost, a price paid not in dollars, but in sweat, dignity, and lives. Fire and revolution. Strikes erupted, bullets flew, and factories burned. From Homestead to Pullman, the working class rose against their masters, demanding dignity in the shadow of industry's giants. Hook. The sound of progress once rang like music across America. The clang of steel, the whistle of locomotives, the thunder of factories. But by the 1890s, that music had turned into a roar of rage. Beneath the shining towers of industry, millions of workers toiled in darkness, their sweat fueling the dreams of a few men at the top. When they finally stood up, the nation shook. The Gilded Age caught fire, not in boardrooms or banks, but on the factory floors, where men and women fought for their lives, their rights, and their place in the American dream. The seeds of revolt. By the end of the 19th century, America had transformed into an industrial powerhouse. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, railroads cutting across the Midwest, and textile factories spinning through the night. But for the workers who powered this revolution, life was brutal. In the mills, 12-hour shifts were common. Wages barely kept families alive. Injuries were routine. Deaths were shrugged off as the cost of production. Immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, German, crowded into slums near the factories, their children working alongside them before they were even teenagers. As the profits of men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan soared, resentment smoldered. Newspapers called it the labor question. Workers called it injustice. When the spark finally came, it was lit in the heart of the steel empire. Homestead Strike, 1892. Homestead, Pennsylvania, a name that would be burned into the memory of American labor forever. Andrew Carnegie's steel mill on the banks of the Monongahela River was one of the most advanced in the world, but its progress came at a terrible cost. Carnegie, though publicly known as a philanthropist, had grown restless with the workers' demands for fair wages. His business partner, Henry Clay Frick, a man notorious for his ruthlessness, was determined to crush the Union once and for all. In the summer of 1892, Frick announced wage cuts of up to 20% and locked out the steelworkers when they refused to accept them. The workers, members of the powerful Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, took control of the mill, organizing armed guards to keep Frick's men out. Frick's response was swift and deadly. He hired 300 Pinkerton detectives, private soldiers paid to break strikes. On July 6th, as the Pinkertons approached the mill on barges under the cover of night, thousands of workers and their families gathered on the riverbank. Shots rang out. Chaos erupted. For 14 hours, the two sides exchanged gunfire. By dawn, 9 workers and 7 Pinkertons lay dead. When the state militia arrived, they weren't there to protect the workers. They came to restore order and to put the mill back in Carnegie's hands. The strike collapsed, and the Union was shattered. The Homestead Strike became a symbol of the industrial war between labor and capital, a war that would define an era. Flames in Chicago, the Pullman Strike of 1894. 2 years later, the flames of rebellion reignited, this time in Chicago. George Pullman was another industrial titan, the maker of luxury railroad sleeping cars. To outsiders, he was a visionary who built a model company town for his workers, complete with tidy houses, schools, and parks. But there was a catch. Pullman owned everything, including the homes. When the Panic of 1893 plunged the country into economic depression, Pullman slashed wages by nearly 25%, but did not lower the rent. Workers found themselves trapped, unable to survive or leave. Desperate, they turned to Eugene V. Debs and the IRU, which called for a nationwide boycott of trains carrying Pullman cars. Within days, the strike spread like wildfire. By June 1894, 250,000 railroad workers across 27 states joined the movement. Trains were stopped, mail deliveries halted, and the economy ground to a standstill. For the first time, it wasn't just a local protest. It was a national labor uprising. The federal government, fearing chaos, sent 12,000 troops to Chicago. President Grover Cleveland declared the strike a threat to public order. On July 7th, soldiers opened fire on protesters. Dozens were killed, hundreds injured. Rail cars burned, railroads were torn apart, and the city became a war zone. In the aftermath, Debs was arrested, and the IRU was destroyed. But the strike left behind a powerful message that the working class could challenge the mighty machine of industry, even if they lost. The age of strikes and shadows. The 19th century was not an isolated explosion. It was part of a pattern. Across the country, miners, railroaders, and textile workers rose up, demanding shorter hours, safer conditions, and fair pay. In 1886, the Haymarket Affair in Chicago had already set the stage. What began as a peaceful rally for an 8-hour workday turned deadly when a bomb exploded among police officers. The chaos led to the execution of labor leaders and a nationwide fear of radicalism. Business owners began labeling union members as anarchists and communists. The word labor became synonymous with rebellion. Newspapers owned by industrialists portrayed strikers as threats to civilization. But behind the fear was truth. America's working class was awakening. The Industrial Revolution had created immense wealth, but it had also created a new class divide. The fight for labor rights wasn't just economic, it was moral. It was about the meaning of freedom in a nation that claimed to stand for liberty. Women, children, and the forgotten fighters. The revolutions of the factory floor weren't fought by men alone. Across textile mills in Massachusetts and the garment factories of New York, women and children made up a large part of the workforce. In Lowell, Massachusetts, the mill girls, young women who left their farms to work in spinning mills, organized some of the earliest strikes in American history, protesting pay cuts and grueling hours. Later, women like Mother Jones, a fiery Irish immigrant, became legendary for leading miners' wives and children in marches demanding justice. Her rallying cry, "Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living," became a banner for labor activism nationwide. Children as young as 8 worked in coal mines and factories, their small hands ideal for dangerous machinery. Reformers began publishing shocking photographs and reports, stirring public outrage. Slowly, Americans began to see that industrial progress came with a terrible human price. Legacy of steel. Out of steel and smoke, America's modern world was born. Its power, cities, and inequalities still forged in the same fires that once lit the furnaces of the industrial titans. When the last furnaces cooled and the smoke began to fade from America's steel towns, what remained was not silence, but a heartbeat. The echoes of clanging hammers and roaring furnaces didn't just build cities, they built the foundation of modern America itself. Every skyscraper piercing the sky, every railroad stretching across the plains, every bridge spanning the nation's rivers still carries within it the spirit and the scars of that age of steel. The nation steel built. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States had become the workshop of the world. In just a few decades, it transformed from a war-torn republic into a global industrial giant, its power forged in steel and fire. Steel wasn't just a material, it was a revolution. It made possible the skyscraper, that daring symbol of ambition that redefined the skyline. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh rose like iron forests, their towers proclaiming that America's future was upward. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, was one of the first wonders of this new world, an architectural miracle held together by thousands of steel wires. Decades later, the Empire State Building would soar above Manhattan in just 410 days, a feat possible only because steel could bear the dreams that stone never could. From the hulls of battleships to the skeletons of factories, steel was everywhere. It was the sinew of progress, the metal that made the impossible real. And yet, it was also the mirror that reflected the soul of the nation, a soul divided between genius and greed, prosperity and poverty. The Titans and their shadows. The industrial titans who forged America's power also forged its contradictions. Men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan believed they were building not just fortunes, but a future. And in many ways, they were right. Carnegie's U.S. Steel Corporation, founded in 1901 and valued at over $1 billion, the first company in history to reach that mark, became the symbol of industrial dominance. It employed hundreds of thousands, producing the steel that built the rails, bridges, and cities of an expanding empire. Rockefeller's oil fueled the machines. Morgan's finance sustained the flow of capital, and together they created an economy unlike anything the world had ever seen. America was now a nation defined by production, consumption, and ambition. But beneath the shining surface, the cost was immense. The working class that powered this new world often lived in poverty and peril. Immigrant families in places like Homestead, Chicago, and Gary, Indiana, lived in the shadow of the mills, breathing the soot of progress. Steel had made America rich, but not everyone shared in that wealth. The rise of the rust. By the mid-20th century, steel was no longer just the foundation of America, it was its identity. During both world wars, American steel became the arsenal of democracy, building tanks, ships, and weapons that helped secure victory. The mills of Pittsburgh and Cleveland worked day and night, their flames lighting the sky like a second sun. After the war, prosperity soared. Veterans came home, highways were built, suburbs expanded, and consumer America was born. The gleaming automobiles of Detroit, the sprawling interstate highways, and the urban skylines all rested on steel's unbreakable backbone. But empires built on fire often cool with time. By the 1970s, the once proud steel cities began to tremble. Foreign competition, automation, and corporate greed eroded the foundations. Pittsburgh, Bethlehem, Youngstown, and Gary, once roaring with life, grew silent. Mills closed. Families moved away. The furnaces that had once symbolized progress now stood as monuments of loss. The Rust Belt was born, and with it came a new kind of American story, one of resilience amid ruin. From steel to silicon. The fall of steel did not mark the end of America's greatness, only its transformation. The same relentless drive that built the furnaces of Pittsburgh turned towards the glowing screens of Silicon Valley. Where steel had forged the industrial age, technology now forged the digital one. The new titans, Jobs, Gates, and Musk, were heirs to Carnegie and Rockefeller, driven by the same fire of ambition. The furnaces of the past became the data centers of the present. The rails became fiber optic cables. Yet the legacy of steel still lived on, in spirit and in consequence. The concentration of wealth, the power of corporations, the struggle of workers for fair wages, all echoed the old battles between labor and capital. The names changed, but the fight remained the same. Just as the workers of Homestead had demanded dignity, so too did modern Americans question the cost of progress, asking whether innovation without humanity was progress at all. The steel in America's soul. Today, as one walks through the abandoned mills of Pennsylvania, or stands atop the shining observation deck of One World Trade Center, itself a monument of modern steel, it's impossible not to feel the weight of history pressing through time. The story of steel is the story of America itself, ambitious, ruthless, visionary, and flawed. It tells of a people who dreamed so big they reshaped the earth, and of the workers who paid for those dreams with their lives and labor. In many ways, we still live in the shadow of the Titans. Their foundations remain under our feet, in our infrastructure, our economy, and our culture. Every gleaming building and polished machine is a descendant of their world. The wealth gap they created endures. The spirit of innovation they unleashed endures, and the constant tension between human dignity and industrial power, that too endures. The unfinished legacy. Perhaps the true legacy of steel is not in what was built, but in what it taught us. It taught America that progress is never free, that behind every great invention lies a moral question. Who benefits and who bears the burden? It taught us that power, once concentrated, always seeks to grow, whether in steel mills, oil fields, or tech empires. And it taught us that every generation must decide for itself what kind of nation it will build from the fires it inherits. Steel gave America its bones, but the heart, the courage to rise, to build, to question, that came from the people who worked beneath the smoke, believing that even in the hardest metal, humanity could leave its mark. Epilogue. Today, the furnaces are quiet, but their echoes remain. In the bridges that still stand, in the towers that still reach skyward, and in the unbreakable American will to build, to dream, to endure. Out of steel and smoke, a nation was born, and though the fires may fade, the legacy of steel will never die.